March 17, 1943, Berlin. A folder slammed onto the mahogany desk of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Chief of German Military Intelligence. The impact sent a tremor through the porcelain coffee cup beside him, dark liquid splashing across coded reports, documents that, if ever seen by the Gestapo, would mean his death. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the slow tick of a wall clock and the faint hum of the city outside. Through tall windows, the gray water of the Landwehr Canal drifted past, a grim reminder of another body thrown into it years earlier. Rosa Luxemburg, silenced by a system that, in its own time, had also mistaken brutality for strength. Now, 24 years later, Canaris faced a truth that threatened to destroy yet another empire built on false conviction. He lifted the report, his eyes scanning the figures once more. The numbers did not change. They spoke of something that seemed mathematically impossible, strategically catastrophic, and ideologically intolerable. According to his agents in Mexico City, the Ford Motor Company Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Canaris read it again, one bomber per hour. An aircraft of 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, and 30,000 components assembled into a machine weighing 18 tons. He whispered to himself, "It cannot be." Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, standing rigidly before the desk, had checked the intelligence 3 times. The sources were solid: Mexican industrialists, Spanish intermediaries, even Swedish businessmen who had toured the facility. The conclusion was always the same. Germany, which could scarcely produce 1,000 aircraft in a month, was being eclipsed by a single American factory. Canaris closed the folder, his hand trembling slightly. He had seen many illusions in his career, but this was different. This wasn't a rumor. It was a mirror held up to the Reich's delusion of supremacy. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, Berlin's smoke-choked skyline stretched beneath a pale winter sun. Trains groaned across distant bridges, carrying men and material toward a war that, even then, was slipping away. Behind him, Heinz broke the silence. "Herr Admiral, I fear these numbers are not propaganda. They are production." Canaris turned slowly. "Then Germany," he said quietly, "has already lost." The failure had begun long before this morning. 2 years earlier, in 1941, Luftwaffe General Karl Köhler had presented Hermann Göring with similar reports from Washington. American aircraft output, it claimed, had reached 2,000 planes per month. Göring had laughed. His laughter had echoed through the marble halls of the Reich Air Ministry, booming, derisive, contemptuous. "Americans can build refrigerators and razor blades," he had declared, "not machines of war." He had told Hitler the same thing days after Pearl Harbor. Their democracy makes them weak. Their mongrel population makes them inefficient. Their Jews make them corrupt. They cannot possibly produce what they claim. Those words became dogma, unchallenged, unexamined, lethal. Now, in 1943, German agents across the Americas were reporting a reality that mocked every assumption of Nazi ideology. Letters intercepted from Detroit workers described endless shifts, entire families employed in the same plant, women and Black Americans assembling bombers with tireless precision. At first, Berlin dismissed these as Allied psychological warfare. Then came photographs, diagrams, eyewitness accounts, all telling the same incredible story. Willow Run was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A mile-long assembly line, 42,000 workers, a building so vast that clouds sometimes formed beneath its roof, and it occasionally rained indoors. Admiral Canaris traced his finger along the figures one last time. He could almost see it in his mind, a river of aluminum and steel flowing toward war. His air intelligence officer, Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter, understood it better than anyone. Ritter had lived in New York for a decade before the war, his apartment overlooking the construction of the Chrysler Building. He had watched Americans raise a skyscraper in less than 2 years. "Admiral," he said when summoned to the office that day, "if these numbers are correct, and I believe they are, then victory for us is mathematically impossible. It is only a question of time." For Canaris, a man who had once served the empire with loyalty, it was a sentence heavier than treason. He knew how Berlin would react, not with strategy, but with denial. Already, the machinery of disbelief was turning. Göring would dismiss the reports as forgeries, Hitler would call them absurd, and the intelligence officers who insisted otherwise would be branded defeatists. Yet the evidence kept coming. From Mexico City, Agent Georg Nikolaus reported a conversation overheard at a German-Mexican business reception. An American oil executive, Harold Morrison, had returned from a tour of the Willow Run plant. After several drinks, he described what he had seen. "The assembly line is a mile long," Morrison said. "They build bombers like cars, section by section. Wing assemblies come from one side, fuselages from another, tail sections from a third. They meet like rivers flowing into the sea." A German agent asked whether such complexity caused delays. Morrison laughed. "Ford broke the bomber into 60,000 operations. Each worker repeats a single task until perfect. Women, Negro women, do the same work as men. They train them in days, not months." Ritter's agents transcribed every word. Within weeks, that report lay on Canaris's desk, the very folder that now stained with coffee trembling beneath his fingertips. Outside, the muffled thrum of Berlin's wartime life continued. Trams clattering, soldiers shouting, the distant air raid sirens of a capital that still believed itself invincible. But inside that office, beneath the pale March light, one man understood that the war had already been lost. Not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor of an enemy who believed in something far more dangerous than conquest. They believed in work, and through work they would forge the very engines of Germany's destruction. 1 week later, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris found himself summoned to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf-S lair, Hitler Gysi's command fortress in the east. The call came not through channels of protocol, but with the sharp immediacy of fear. No one summoned the head of German intelligence lightly. The air outside was frigid. Columns of pines whispered above the snow-covered bunkers as Canaris stepped from his staff car, his breath a faint mist. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Generals Jodl and Keitel stood beside a long oak table, its surface cluttered with maps of the Eastern Front. Hitler sat at the head, his eyes bloodshot, a hand trembling faintly as he traced the lines of the front around Kursk. When Canaris spoke, his voice was low, measured, yet edged with desperation. "Mein Führer, if the Americans are producing 1,400 B-24 bombers a month, plus their B-17s, and fighters, the scale of their aerial bombardment will soon exceed our defensive capacity." Hitler didn't look up. "Admiral," he said at last, his tone both dismissive and weary, "the Americans are capable of mass production of simple goods, cars, radios, kitchen appliances, but not of precision machines. A bomber is not a car. It requires skill, discipline, national spirit. These are things a democracy cannot manufacture." Canaris tried again. "Mein Führer, the data is consistent. From Spain, from Sweden, from neutral states." "The figures are false," Hitler snapped, his palm slapping the table. "They entered the war 16 months ago. To achieve this scale would require decades of preparation. It is impossible." General Jodl, attempting diplomacy, ran a quick calculation on his notepad. "Even if we assume only 1/4 of these numbers—" Hitler cut him off with a glare. "No, Jodl, I will not have the Reich paralyzed by fear of American propaganda. We have seen their industry. Soft, undisciplined, dependent on foreigners. They are not Germans. They are not capable of greatness." And that, Canaris knew, was the end of truth. Unknown to the Führer, the Admiral already possessed something even more damning than numbers: motion picture film. Obtained through his American contacts in Switzerland, smuggled out through Spanish diplomatic pouches, it showed 5 minutes of footage from inside Willow Run. That night, in a locked room at Abwehr headquarters, Canaris and his deputy, Hans Oster, watched the film alone. The camera moved down the assembly line like an unblinking eye, past endless rows of women in coveralls riveting metal, past men of every color and age fitting engines and wings, past aircraft in every stage of becoming. The camera paused on a wall clock, the second hand sweeping, indifferent, as one completed bomber rolled past and another took its place. When the reel ended, Oster sat frozen. "My God," he whispered, "it's true." Canaris lit a cigarette, then wordlessly set the film alight with its flame. They watched in silence as it burned to ash. "We cannot show them," he said. "They would call it a forgery, or worse." Outside, the city groaned beneath another night of Allied bombing. The truth lay in ashes on the floor. By late 1943, further confirmation arrived, this time from the skies. A Spanish diplomat, sympathetic to Germany, had managed to take aerial photographs of Willow Run. The images, smuggled across the Atlantic, revealed parking lots filled with thousands of cars, assembly bays stretching the length of football fields, and rows of finished bombers at adjacent airfields awaiting delivery. German photo analysts spent weeks verifying the images. Their conclusion was grimly precise. Photographic evidence confirms human intelligence. Production rate appears accurate. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment. When the photographs reached Goering, he laughed and waved them aside. "Clever American trickery," he said. "Scale models, painted skylights. I will not be made a fool of by these illusions." But not everyone laughed. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, obtained copies of the intelligence through quiet channels. Of all Hitler's lieutenants, he alone grasped the magnitude of industrial arithmetic. He read the figures once, twice, then wrote in his diary on May 15, 1943, "If the Willow Run numbers are even half correct, we face not defeat, but annihilation. They produce in 1 month what we produce in a year. Yet to speak this aloud would be to sign my own death warrant." Even within the Sicherheitsdienst, the Reich's internal intelligence arm, the same realization dawned. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, a trained economist, analyzed American production capacity and concluded in December 1943. At current rates, by mid-1944, the Americans will possess sufficient bombers to drop our entire 1940 London tonnage every single day. The report reached Heinrich Himmler's desk. It was never discussed again. In the United States, meanwhile, the rhythm of production had become almost holy. At Willow Run, the whistle blew at dawn. Workers, women in kerchiefs, men with lunch pails, young boys scarcely out of school, streamed through the gates. Each learned their motion, their fraction of labor. One tightened a rivet, another fitted a cable, another sealed a panel. Tens of thousands of gestures synchronized to the heartbeat of democracy. Among them was Rose Will-Monroe, later known as Rosie the Riveter. She worked the gun that drove the rivets into the aluminum skin of bombers bound for the skies over Europe. Years later, she would recall, "Every rivet I drove, I thought, might be the one holding my brother's plane together." Each week, the factory floor shimmered with motion. Women balancing drills on their hips, mechanics guiding cranes, supervisors timing production with clipboards and stopwatches. Above them, catwalks trembled with the vibration of machinery. Clouds condensed beneath the ceiling beams. Sometimes it rained inside, and every hour, without fail, another B-24 Liberator rolled from the far doors, gleaming beneath the Michigan sun. In Berlin, the blindness persisted. On Christmas Eve 1943, Canaris received a new report. American production projections for the coming year: 18,000 B-24s, 12,000 B-17s, 1,000 B-29s, 40,000 fighters. In total, 86,000 aircraft in a single year. When presented to Hitler, he scoffed. They claim they will build more aircraft in 1 year than all nations in history combined. Absurd. Let them dream their numbers. We will bury them in steel and willpower. But by February 1944, the dream had already become reality. Canaris was removed from his post, officially reassigned for administrative inefficiency, unofficially suspected of defeatism. His replacement, Walter Schellenberg, was a loyal Nazi, efficient, polite, and utterly obedient. He would never again speak a truth that contradicted the Reich. Still, the truth did not need to be spoken. It would soon roar above them. On February the 20th, 1944, the American 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument. Big week. Over 6 days, more than 1,000 heavy bombers struck German aircraft factories, rail lines, and supply depots. The sky over Europe darkened with contrails. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter aces, landed his Messerschmitt after one of the battles, his face ashen. He walked straight to Göring. "Herr Reichsmarschall," he said, "I have seen 800 bombers in a single formation. These are no illusions. These are real, and they are dropping real bombs." Göring turned away without answering. For the first time, even he began to understand. The bombers he had refused to believe in were now above him. By spring of 1944, the thunder over Europe had become constant. At first light, farmers across France would look up and see the sky webbed with vapor trails, white ribbons twisting endlessly toward the east. The sound was not that of planes, but of a tide, a mechanical ocean breaking against the continent. In the forests outside Kassel, where the Fieseler aircraft works once hummed, only the shells of buildings remained. In Stuttgart, Daimler-Benz had moved its engine assembly underground. In Regensburg, the Messerschmitt plant stood in ruins. Everywhere the same sight: twisted steel, crumpled girders, and the faint smell of burned aluminum. And yet, still the bombers came. The Allies were no longer fighting for parity. They were fighting with abundance. Each plane that fell was replaced within days, sometimes within hours. The Americans called it production elasticity. The Germans called it madness. Inside the Willow Run plant, the rhythm never stopped. New workers arrived daily, trained on the floor itself. Ford engineers devised moving scaffolds, mobile toolkits, even color-coded wiring to make assembly foolproof. At the far end of the line, each bomber received its finishing touches. The nose turret installed, the propellers aligned, the Liberator name stenciled in fresh black paint. On May 24, 1944, reporters were invited to witness something almost mythic: the rollout of the 5,000th B-24. Cameras flashed, bands played, and above the factory doors hung a banner: "The Might of America, forged by free men and women." A photographer caught one image that would appear in papers across the world: a row of young women, grease on their faces, smiling beside a completed bomber. One of them, holding her goggles in hand, looked directly into the lens. Her expression was neither pride nor triumph, but calm inevitability, as though she already understood that history had turned. In Berlin, the air grew heavy with disbelief. Albert Speer's analysts now confirmed that the United States had outproduced Germany by more than 5-1 in aircraft and nearly 10-1 in tanks and trucks. The figures, he wrote later, were beyond comprehension. At a meeting that June, Hitler paced the floor of his bunker. "We will introduce new weapons," he declared. "Jets, rockets, miracle bombs. These will restore balance." But even as he spoke, the imbalance had already decided the war. The factories Speer built in mountains and caves could produce machines, but not pilots, not fuel, not time. Across the Channel, airfields in England swarmed with activity. Rows of B-24s stretched to the horizon, each marked with bright insignia, each fueled and loaded for the coming invasion. Crews checked their maps, adjusted oxygen lines, tested radios. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the engines ignited in unison. From every airfield, from Norfolk to Cornwall, the bombers rose. The sound reached the ground like an earthquake. Windows rattled in the villages below. In London, office workers stepped onto rooftops to watch the endless stream of aircraft crossing southward. One observer wrote in his diary, "It was as if the sky itself were in motion. I stopped counting at 1,000. The air trembled for an hour after they passed." Below those formations, the beaches of Normandy awaited. The air offensive that had begun with Willow Run's first Liberator now served its final purpose, clearing the skies, destroying rail lines, isolating German reinforcements. For the Wehrmacht, it was the beginning of the end. By late summer, what remained of the Luftwaffe was reduced to a token force. Fuel reserves dwindled to a few days. Training flights were canceled. Pilots barely old enough to shave were sent into battle against veterans flying in overwhelming numbers. One of them, 19-year-old Unteroffizier Karl Fischer, later recalled, "I took off with 9 others from our field near Bonn. By the time we reached altitude, the sky was already filled with contrails. Then I saw them, hundreds of bombers, layer upon layer, stretching as far as I could see. We attacked. I fired a few bursts before my engine caught fire. When I parachuted, the air was full of falling metal. I thought, this is not war, this is judgment." At night, the bombing continued. Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Dresden, all bore witness to the weight of Willow Run. Meanwhile, in Michigan, the workers followed the war through radio broadcasts pinned to bulletin boards. Many had sons, husbands, or brothers in the air. When casualty lists arrived, silence spread across the floor, yet the line never stopped. A journalist once asked one of the women on the line, "Don't you ever get tired?" She smiled faintly. "When the planes stop flying," she said, "then we'll rest." By autumn of 1944, German intelligence, what remained of it, had become an echo chamber of defeat. Reports from occupied France confirmed what Canaris had warned more than a year earlier. The Americans could not be stopped because they could not be outbuilt. One intercepted Allied message sealed the realization. Request additional 500 B-24s for European operations to replace attrition. 500 aircraft. To the Americans, a logistical adjustment. To the Germans, an impossible dream. In October, Albert Speer visited the ruins of the Junkers plant in Dessau. The once proud assembly halls lay open to the sky. Snow fell through the shattered roof beams, settling on the wreckage of half-finished fuselages. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "They have turned the act of production into a weapon. We build machines. They build worlds." At the same hour, across the Atlantic, another B-24 rolled out of Willow Run. It was numbered 8685. On its fuselage, one worker had painted a small phrase, "This one for the boys already home." The war was nearing its final act, and the rhythm of industry had become its own kind of prayer. A prayer of rivets and smoke, answered not in words, but in victory. By January 1945, the Third Reich was a skeleton of its former self. The grand illusions that once filled its maps and speeches had been replaced by silence and ruin. Cities that had been symbols of German genius, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, were now testaments to what happens when pride meets steel and fire. The air raids no longer came in waves. They came as weather. The night sky glowed orange across the horizon, and children in cellars mistook the rumble for thunder. Above them, somewhere beyond the clouds, flew the mechanical offspring of Willow Run, the bombers that had once been little more than a rumor, now a relentless fact. Albert Speer stood in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery Garden one morning, wrapped in his greatcoat, staring at the vapor trails etched across the winter sky. He knew the arithmetic too well. He had read the production reports, compared the numbers line by line. The Allies had built over 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany had managed just over 39,000, most of them without fuel, pilots, or hope. He later wrote, "We had lost the war not when our armies faltered, but when the first 1,000 bombers left Detroit's assembly lines." In America, that same winter, Willow Run reached its peak. Production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The plant was a city unto itself, complete with cafeterias, nurseries, even an on-site hospital. Workers trudged through the snow at dawn, their breath rising in clouds, entering through vast steel doors into a world of light and sound. Henry Ford, now aged and slowed, visited the plant for what would be the last time. He watched silently from a catwalk as another B-24 rolled toward the testing field. "They said it couldn't be done," he murmured. "Now we do it every hour." Across the ocean, in Germany's shrinking heartland, the last vestiges of denial were collapsing. The Luftwaffe's airfields were graveyards of broken wings. Fuel drums stood empty. The once proud Messerschmitt jets, the Me-262s, brilliant in design but too few in number, took off on missions that ended minutes later for lack of fuel. Adolf Galland, the ace pilot who had warned Göring a year before, was summoned once again. This time, he no longer argued. "Herr Reichsmarschall," he said quietly, "we are no longer an air force. We are a memory." Göring, swollen and exhausted, stared at him for a long time. "You will see," he muttered. "One miracle weapon will change everything." But no miracle came. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign had become methodical, surgical, almost detached. Targets were chosen by committees. Flight paths were plotted by mathematicians. Factories, railways, refineries, all reduced to numbers on maps. The morality of destruction was never spoken aloud. It was buried beneath calculations of efficiency. When Dresden burned in February 1945, the firestorm consumed 40 square kilometers of the city. Survivors later said the heat was so intense it melted glass in the streets. For many of the pilots above, it was their 32nd or 33rd mission. Another flight, another city, another day in the rhythm of industrial war. At Willow Run, few knew the names of the cities their bombers destroyed. They only knew production targets, quotas, and schedules. The workers were told their efforts shortened the war, saved lives, and perhaps they did. Yet somewhere within that truth lay the quieter tragedy of modernity, the distance between the maker and the consequence. In Berlin, Canaris's ghost still lingered. He had been executed the previous year, hanged slowly with piano wire for his part in the July 20th plot against Hitler. His final words, as recorded by a witness, were almost prophetic. "You cannot wage war against the future." By March, the Reich was collapsing. Armies crumbled, cities surrendered, and even the most devoted officers no longer believed. Speer, now fully aware of the end, defied Hitler's orders to destroy Germany's remaining infrastructure. He issued secret directives to save bridges, factories, and power stations, hoping that one day Germany could rise again, not as a conqueror, but as a builder. On April the 12th, 1945, across the Atlantic, news spread through the Willow Run plant that President Roosevelt had died. The whistles stopped. The machines went silent for 1 minute. Men and women bowed their heads, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. For many, it was the first time in years the factory floor was quiet. Then, without instruction, someone restarted a drill. Another lifted a rivet gun. Within moments, the sound returned, the endless hum of creation. One worker, when asked why they kept going, simply said, "Because he would have wanted us to finish." And they did. By April's end, Berlin lay in ruins. Soviet tanks rolled through the streets. Hitler was dead. His empire dissolved into dust and smoke. In the final chaos, the myth of German supremacy in production and precision died with him. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. In the skies that day, no bombers flew. The contrails that had once covered the continent faded, leaving behind a silence as profound as the destruction they had wrought. Thousands of miles away, in Michigan, the Willow Run assembly line shut down for the last time. The final B-24, freshly painted, rolled out under a banner that read simply, "Mission accomplished." Workers cheered, some wept. For 4 years they had lived by the rhythm of machines, by the creed of urgency. Now the war that had defined their lives was over, and the great machine of war stood still. Outside, spring sunlight fell on the empty runways. A wind moved through the hangars. For the first time in years, it was quiet enough to hear it. Yet, within that silence lingered the echo of what had been achieved, a reminder that the strength of free people, when joined by purpose, could alter the fate of the world. The German agents who had once dismissed the first reports of Willow Run would never know that the truth they doubted had not only come to pass, but had remade the century itself. When the guns at last fell silent, and Europe lay beneath a haze of smoke and dust, the question turned from how the war was won to what it had cost. The answer, like the war itself, was industrial. Factories that once produced destruction were now summoned to rebuild. The same hands that had riveted bombers would now forge tractors, automobiles, and the quiet machinery of peacetime. Willow Run, this vast cathedral of aluminum and labor, was no longer needed for war. Yet its spirit, the relentless rhythm of production, would echo through the decades that followed. In the summer of 1945, the plant floor stood nearly empty. Rows of silent machines gleamed under skylights. The sound of drills and conveyors had vanished, replaced by the soft shuffle of cleanup crews sweeping away metal dust. On the far wall, where a banner once read, "Every hour a bomber," someone had scrawled a new message in chalk, "Every hour, peace." Ford engineers debated what to do with the complex. Some proposed turning it into a civilian production hub, others a monument. Eventually, the government repurposed sections for post-war manufacturing and storage. For years afterward, residents of Ypsilanti would still point toward the horizon and say, "That's where we built the planes that ended the war." Across the ocean, in the rubble of Berlin, Albert Speer awaited trial. Sitting in his cell at Nuremberg, he wrote by the dim light of a single bulb. His memoirs carried no illusions, only the cold clarity of a man who had seen numbers become death. "We were defeated," he wrote, "not by armies alone, but by an idea, the belief that free men and women, united by purpose rather than coercion, could outbuild any tyranny." Willow Run was not just a factory. It was a symbol of that idea, a machine of liberty. Historians would later echo that thought. Willow Run became the template for the modern world, the marriage of mass production, technology, and social will. It proved that democracy, often dismissed as inefficient, could move with the precision of any dictatorship when survival demanded it. But there was also a quieter legacy, one written not in ledgers or tonnage, but in human memory. For Roswell Monroe, who had once stood on the line driving rivets into B-24 wings, peace meant return. She went back to civilian life, raised a family, and years later became the face of the American woman worker. When asked about the factory, she smiled and said, "We didn't just build planes. We built a world where our children could fly without fear." Others were less certain. Some pilots who had flown those bombers wrestled with guilt over the cities reduced to ash. "I never saw the people below," one veteran admitted in 1952. "Only lights, only targets. But I still hear them when I close my eyes." Time, however, softened the edges of both pride and regret. As decades passed, the name Willow Run came to signify not the destruction it enabled, but the unity it represented, the proof that ordinary people, given faith and purpose, could achieve the impossible. By the 1950s, parts of the plant had been reactivated for the Cold War, producing components for new generations of aircraft. The hum returned, though never with the same urgency. The war had been won. The factory now served a quieter purpose. Then, as the century turned, the plant aged into memory. By the early 2000s, much of it stood abandoned. Rust crept along the beams, pigeons nested in rafters once blackened by exhaust. A place that had once symbolized the height of human progress now seemed a relic of it. Yet, even in decay, there was dignity. When demolition crews arrived, historians and veterans gathered for a final walk through the corridors. Some carried cameras, others carried nothing but silence. One elderly man, a former line supervisor, paused before the last surviving assembly track. "You could feel the floor shake back then," he said softly. "It was like the heartbeat of the country." That heartbeat, though inaudible now, had once echoed across oceans. In Germany, new generations studied the lessons of Willow Run in universities and war colleges. Economists called it the victory of scale, proof that innovation, when combined with free enterprise, could become a weapon more decisive than any bomb. But the deeper lesson was morale. The same system that had built bombers could also build bridges, schools, and cities. The same ingenuity that waged war could, if guided by conscience, preserve peace. In 2014, a movement began to preserve the part of the original Willow Run plant as a museum. The goal was not to glorify war, but to remember the unity and purpose that defined that moment in history. Volunteers, many descendants of the original workers, raised funds to save the last section of the assembly line. When it reopened years later, the building stood not as a monument to power, but to people. Inside, restored B-24 sections gleamed under soft light. Visitors could walk the same floor where, decades before, a bomber had rolled off every hour. A small plaque near the entrance bore a simple inscription. They believed they could build faster than fear could destroy. And they were right. Outside, the Michigan wind still swept across the empty fields where the runways once lay. The grass had grown over the concrete, but if one stood quietly enough, it was possible, just barely, to imagine the echo of engines, the rhythm of hammers, the pulse of a nation at work. The story of Willow Run is not merely one of machines or numbers. It is a story of faith, faith in human capacity, in freedom, in the idea that determination could become destiny. For the Germans who first dismissed it as impossible, Willow Run was a ghost story, a factory too vast to exist, a myth of American exaggeration. But for the world that followed, it became proof of what the human will could achieve when it refused to surrender to despair. In the end, Willow Run was not a place of war. It was a place where ordinary people, through the simple act of work, helped end one. And in that quiet triumph, the 20th century found both its greatest victory and its most enduring question. If humanity can build engines of such power in the name of destruction, what might it build in the name of peace? The answer still waits, somewhere between the hum of a machine and the hope of a better tomorrow.